and welcome to a special Wood TV Plus production, The Fitz 50 Years Later. I'm digital reporter Madeline Bursma.
And I'm Matt Jarowski. November 10th, 2025 marks 50 years since the Edmund Fitzgerald was lost on Lake Superior, marking the Great Lakes' biggest mystery and biggest tragedy. We're going to go over all the parts of the story that make it so captivating.
We'll also be speaking with one of the few people to dive the wreckage of the ship, as well as speaking with Storm Teammate Chief Meteorologist Ellen Baca to talk about the intense weather conditions that hit the ship that night.
We'll also hear from organizers of the Edmund Fitzgerald Memorial Swim, who braved those waters to keep the memory of those 29 sailors alive.
But first, let's go through the basics as we break down what really happened that fateful evening.
At 729 feet long, the Edmund Fitzgerald was one of the Great Lakes' mightiest freighters. But even the strongest ship can fall victim to the power of Mother Nature. The Fitzgerald's final voyage began November 9th under sunny skies in Superior, Wisconsin, loaded with more than 26,000 tons of taconite and bound for a steel mill in Detroit. Forecasts called for possible storms, and by evening, the National Weather Service issued gale warnings, upgraded to storm warnings overnight. By the morning of November 10th, winds were gusting near 50 knots, and waves were hitting 16 feet. Rough, but nothing Captain Ernest McSorley and his seasoned crew hadn't handled before. As the day went on, the storm intensified. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, McSorley radioed Captain Bernie Cooper of the nearby Arthur M. Anderson, the first sign of trouble. The Fitzgerald had lost a fence rail, damaged vents, and was starting to list. McSorley agreed to slow down so the Anderson could stay close. Less than an hour later, he reported both radars were out and asked the Anderson to help guide them. By 5:20, winds were gusting to 70 knots and waves were cresting at 25 feet. Shortly after 7 in the evening, the two ships exchanged their final messages. When asked how they were holding up, McSorley replied, "We're holding our own." Minutes later, the Fitzgerald's radar signal disappeared. By 7:22, repeated calls went unanswered. Concerned, Captain Cooper contacted other ships and the Coast Guard. The Anderson reached Whitefish Bay around 9, but was asked to turn back and lead the search for the Fitzgerald. They found debris, including 2 damaged lifeboats, but no sign of life. On November 14th, a Navy plane detected a magnetic anomaly on the lakebed, pinpointing the wreck. Months later, a Coast Guard submersible confirmed what many already feared. The Edmund Fitzgerald had indeed gone down.
All 29 sailors aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald were presumed lost. There's plenty of information and several theories out there as to what caused the ship to go down, but without eyewitness accounts, most historians don't believe we'll ever have a firm answer.
Coming up next, Chief Meteorologist Ellen Baca will join us to discuss those infamous November gales.
Stay with us, there's more to come on the Fitz 50 years later.
And welcome back to the Fitz 50 years later. The biggest factor of the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald was the storm that rolled through the Great Lakes that fateful night. We're joined now by Storm Teammate Chief Meteorologist Ellen Baca to talk about some of the factors of that night. Ellen, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me here today.
So let's just kind of jump in. What made this storm such a problem for the Fitz?
Yeah, 2 big reasons. The first is that it truly was a very powerful storm. So it wasn't one of the most powerful that we've seen in the Great Lakes, but it definitely was very strong. So it was pretty high up there in terms of ranking. And one of the ways that we rank strength when it comes to low pressure storm systems is by that central pressure number. The lower the number, the stronger the winds. And that's anywhere in the world. So luckily, we've been able to find some of that meteorological data showing us what the pressure levels were as the storm rolled right over Lake Superior. That's the second thing that made it so difficult and ultimately deadly was the track that it took. That storm over Lake Superior ended up cutting right over the center of the lake, and that created big changes in the wind direction and the wave action. And then finally, just, technology has changed so much If this storm were to have happened today, there'd be so many more alerts, warnings, forecast models. This could have been very easily avoided in today's day and age. But in the 70s, it just came on too fast.
Right, yeah, that's one of the facts I've kind of uncovered in my research is when they left, the afternoon of the 9th, it was sunny and there was no storm warning.
Yeah, sunny, no storm warning yet. And the next day, as the storm started to hook in and up towards Lake Superior, things just rapidly deteriorated. So one of the ways that we were able to get weather data was not only from like satellite imagery, but also there's a second ship. So I know that you guys have been talking about this, but if we look at the graphics here, I've got a little track plotting the two ships. We have the Edmund Fitzgerald, and then we also have the Anderson. So that's what we showed you earlier to just show you how they were tracking across Lake Superior. So in red here, you have the Edmund Fitzgerald, and in blue, you have the Anderson. So the Anderson has actually given us some of the wind speed values that we've been able to go back and plug into weather models nowadays to re-simulate the storm. And they also were there trying to, you know, help out the Edmund Fitzgerald before the storm ultimately sank.
I know we've mentioned there's a lot of different theories because there were no survivors. We really don't know exactly how the ship went down. There's a lot of theories out there. And one of them is the rogue wave theory, which once upon a time was kind of, you know, thrown to the side. There are a lot of scientists that didn't necessarily put a lot of weight in it, really even just the concept in general. But you were saying earlier, we're finding more and more that rogue waves could have been a real possibility.
Yeah, everybody nowadays has a cell phone. So there's just so much video out there. And even just 15 years ago, when people would be like, I saw a rogue wave out in the open sea or out on Lake Michigan, people would be like, haha, nice sailor's tale, like those don't exist. But then they started, scientists, seeing proof of these huge rogue waves just coming together with waves joining their amplitudes. And they've been able to simulate it now in wave tanks, conditions that are right to create these high amplitude waves. So we know with the wind speed that was recorded with that surface pressure, we should have been seeing waves to 25 feet. And that's not even counting what a rogue wave height could have been. I mean, it's just nuts to think about. Here is the storm track. So November 9th, in the morning, it was still over Kansas. By the time we got to the evening of November 9th, it moved north into Iowa. And remember, pressure, that's that number that you see there at the bottom. As that drops, the storm is getting stronger. This storm rapidly intensified. And by November 9th in the evening, that's when Edmund Fitzgerald started to depart. And the storm was still, you know, states away. So by the time we get to November 10th in the morning, you'll notice that number has dropped again, 982 millibars. That's incredibly strong. At this point in time, the wind would be out of the southeast. So the ships would be seeing the waves crashing into them. But then as the storm starts to move north even further and continue to strengthen, the wind direction would change and come out of the northwest. So hang with me. You can see the storm placement for the 10th in the morning, how the wind is out of the southeast. As that storm lifted a little bit further on in the evening, boom, the wind direction rapidly changes, just like with a hurricane. So, I mean, gosh, that would put it right near Whitefish Point. That potentially could give you some rogue wave action. It definitely is a factor that I think was key in the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
Yeah, that's right where the two circles kind of overlap there. That is really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, Ellen, thanks so much for obviously kind of shining your expertise on all this. It makes really fascinating stuff. And the finding on the wind directions, that is really cool too.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, stick with us. We'll have more on the Fitz 50 years later after this. Welcome back. This is the Fitz 50 years later, a Wood TV Plus special. Joining us now, shipwreck historian and someone who's actually seen the wreckage of the Edmund Fitzgerald in person. Rick Mixer is live with us. Rick, thanks for taking the time to talk to us today. And I know you're no stranger to local newsrooms.
No, in fact, I was lucky enough to spend almost 25 years of my life in local newsrooms from the UP all the way down to Saginaw Bay City.
Right. So very few people know more about the Edmund Fitzgerald than you do. And like I said, you're one of the few people who's actually seen it. Let's talk about your 1994 dive down to the wreckage. Can you kind of walk us through that?
Yeah, we rented a submarine called the Delta, which actually had been last occupied by Bob Ballard, who found the Titanic. He dove the Lusitania. So we had every belief that this submarine would be perfect for diving 500 feet. It was only half of the depth of the usable depth on that sub. So it was a little yellow submarine, just like the Beatles would sing
Yeah.
about, and it was two-person. So the pilot sat above me, and I laid on a mat that I could see all the way through the windows. As we went down past 250 feet, it started getting darker and darker, but we reserved our battery power. The submarine is completely electric. So we kept all the lights off until we hit the bottom. So it was pitch black when we hit the bottom, and we used sonar to detect how close we were. And when the lights went on, just a cloud of silt came up from, silt that probably hadn't been disturbed in 15,000 years. So it was weird to look at the moonscape and then turn
Yeah.
to go towards the rope that we had a buoy on the wreck to guide us to the hatch of the Fitz.
Right. Can you kind of even just walk us through so much of what you saw down there? And I know you saw a lot of really interesting things. Things that you had mentioned, there's all sorts of theories about, what actually took the Fitzgerald down. And there are things that you saw down there that you think whether kind of support some of those theories or discount some of them. Can you kind of walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, the only thing we went armed with was the Coast Guard report and basically a very brief visit by Jacques Cousteau's son sent a team down. So we didn't know a whole bunch about it. 1989, there was a dive, but we didn't get much info from it. So it was pretty new to us. And I went right across the bow section. I thought I was still on the bottom of Lake Superior, but it turned out it was the mud that had been thrown up on the deck when that ship went sideways into an underwater hill. And all of a sudden, a big crevasse opened up, and that was the split between the spar deck or the weather deck, the top of the ship, where the cargo hatches are, and the side of the ship. So I looked around immediately for taconite. If it did nosedive, it should have been all piled up there. And I found not a single marble of taconite, 26,000 tons, and it was nowhere to be seen. So immediately I knew that it did not nosedive. And we started going around the vessel, and we went around the bow. We saw how deep the bow was buried. We saw the prow of the ship, the very pointed end of the bow. It was bent over from the impact with the bedrock as it passed through the mud about 17 feet deep. Then we went around and I saw a lot more damage in the front. The drawings that I had seen from the Coast Guard were highly inaccurate, and it didn't help us much at all until we went around to the starboard side and realized that that hill wasn't there. It's only on the port side. So we had a massive wall of steel. And that's when we started counting vents and trying to figure out what was McSorley talking about when he was talking about water coming into the ship.
Sure. Interesting. Obviously, the 94 dive made some headlines because you guys mentioned that you did find a body of a sailor right outside of the wreckage. Can you kind of walk us through? I know you actually weren't in the submersible at that time.
Yeah, in fact, I went to the back of the ship and I looked around the back for more taconite. There was nothing after hatches 8 and 9. We got turned around. I called for permission. Can I please see the stern? And Fred, who was paying for everything, said, go for it. So I went to the back and I looked at the bottom of the ship that's upside down, 260 feet of the ship. Didn't see any scratches of any collision like Captain Cooper believed had happened.
Right.
And then we said, we'll come up. I got lost again at the back of the stern. We couldn't find the ship, and we came up with some reserve power left over. So we let the tug owner and his son go down. His boy wanted to do a report on the Edmund Fitzgerald, and they went down, and within minutes after my dive and they'd gone to the bottom, I went to get a sandwich, and they radioed up that they found somebody with a life jacket on the bottom. And we thought it was, just a misunderstanding, but the video turned out to be definitely what they thought.
Interesting. We can shift gears a little bit. Something I want to talk to you about, because this is really fascinating to me. The Fitzgerald is a protected dive site. It's protected under Canadian law because the understanding between the NTSB or whatever government officials are involved is that it's in Canadian water. But people who have been to that wreck site, including people that you're familiar with, they say at least part of it's in American water, which could really make a whole mess here. What's your take of all this?
When we got done diving with Delta, and I think we did 8 visits, I believe, over 2 days, And Fred put together a map of what he thought where the ship was. Now, we had no way of knowing direction or anything underwater. The compass was spinning uncontrollably. So when I looked at his map, I kind of scratched my head, and he said, it looks like it's in American water. And I thought it was just some trickery of drawing the map. But then when I did my book, Tattletale Sounds, I started calling other submersible pilots that weren't on our expedition. And sure enough, one of the guys just volunteered. He goes, Rick, you know that that's not in American waters. And this was Tim Askew Jr. I talked to him and his father, and Jr. had told me that, yeah, it's definitely in American water. And that brought a whole new light. Here's a guy unsolicited telling me that he had the equipment to measure even on the bottom whether or not they were across the line. The Coast Guard still maintained they were 750 feet into Canadian water. Tom Farnquist, who helped out with 3 different expeditions, told me on camera, I'm telling you, Rick, it's in Canadian waters, but I think it's worth a check. And it'll bring up sad feelings. I understand that, but we should know where that line is, and that will completely change the permission needed to be able to dive that shipwreck.
Right. Yeah, as for the rest of that conversation, we can leave that there. That's for other people to talk about. Real quick, Rick, before I let you go, I know you've written books about this. You regularly speak on this topic. Where can people go to find your work?
And please go to shipwreckpodcast.com or lakefury.com for free podcasts you can listen to from all of my shipwreck survivors, and certainly order the books or go to your very favorite maritime museum. I love supporting these places. That's the best place to buy it, so you can not only help me, but also help the museum to tell these incredible stories.
Awesome. Rick, thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time. We'll be right back with more on the Fitz 50 years later.
And earlier this year, a group of swimmers set out to finish the journey of the Edmund Fitzgerald in honor of those 29 men who lost their lives. And they were able to finish and completed that journey, ending in Detroit. I'm joined now with Jim Dreyer, the organizer behind the event. Jim, welcome. Thanks so much for joining today.
Good morning, Madeline. My pleasure.
And so, of course, setting it up was a bit of a challenge. But then also I know that typically boats are not allowed above the wreck, which is where the swim started. Tell me about that process of getting permission to start on the wreck.
Yeah, it is officially a gravesite, as all 29 men lie there. And so it deservedly is treated with a great deal of respect. So as you said, boats are not usually even allowed to pass over there. So we had to get a special permit from the province of Ontario in order to start the swim there. The fact that this is the 50th anniversary and that we were going to have a ceremony over the Fitzgerald fitting of the ceremony you would expect for the 50th anniversary allowed that to happen. And we were grateful for that.
So then take me to that day of the ceremony. What emotions were going through your head, through the swimmers? What was that feeling like?
Yeah, it's something that none of us will ever forget. As we were above the wreck, just knowing what happened there, and then on our radar, 530 feet below, we could see the image of the wreck below us, and at that point, you could have heard a pin drop, in the cabin as the gravity of all of this just hit us. And after that, we had a ceremony where we read each name of the 29 who perished, and we dropped a white rose in the water after ringing our boat's bell. And the sun had just come up, and there was just a gentle current. And when we read, when we dropped the 30th rose for all mariners who've perished in the Great Lakes, you could just look to our east, and there was just this trail of white roses just gently flowing away. And the whole thing was just, so incredibly moving.
Yeah, what an emotional day it must have been. And I know, so then throughout the swim, you faced several challenges. You went through multiple boats, and tell me about those challenges and what kept you going, what kept you persevering through those challenges?
Well, I'll say this, both my team, the staff, and then certainly the swimmers were just relentless. The mission was bigger than us, and so it kept us going when we went through 4 boats. Now, we're only supposed to use 1 boat. We went through 4. There was just kind of an endless stream of mechanical problems that we dealt with. And, part of that reason also was the weather conditions we were in. There was one point right on the tip of the thumb of Michigan where we saw some 10 to 15 foot waves. Now, the swimmers were not swimming at that time. We had pulled and we were heading back to port, but the boat really, really took a beating. And so, between the weather and the mechanical problems, there was always an issue. And there were times where we had to swim in the morning and it's 10 o'clock at night the night before and we don't have a boat, Madeline. So me and the crew are burning the midnight oil trying to figure out what we're going to do. And there was just no quit in anybody. And, this was an honor of a lifetime to be a part of this. And I think everybody viewed it that way.
And I know that the day that you finished it, you called it Victory Day in the one of the social media posts. What were you feeling that day? What emotions, what was Victory Day like for you as you were able to finish the journey of those 29 men?
Yeah, it was really incredible finishing in Detroit at Belle Isle. I was escorting the swimmers in by kayak, and I watched the swimmers come in and, the media converse on them, and I loved seeing that. The swimmers made history while commemorating history, and so they deserved that moment. I came in the kayak behind them, and the first person that greeted me was a daughter of one of the Edmund Fitzgerald crew. And, she embraced me and she burst into tears, and, then I got emotional as well. And once again, just like the ceremony over the Fitz, at the end, it just really put a face on why we were doing this, to memorialize the 29 men, just to help their memory, live forever. 100 years, at the 100th anniversary, people will be remembering what these crazy swimmers did 50 years ago, and they'll be remembering the men on the Edmund Fitzgerald. And this will be the subject of a documentary film, too, which will help really cement that memory.
What, were there a lot of family members of the crew that were involved in this journey, in this swim?
Yeah, throughout, we were on the road for 38 days, 36 days to complete the 17 stages of the swim. And so at various stages, there were different family members involved. But, certainly I had the honor of communicating with many of them as we were planning this. We've been planning this since 2023. So, a lot of planning and an opportunity to talk to the family members and just, make sure that we were respectfully honoring their loved ones. And I believe that was certainly mission accomplished.
Beautiful. And of course, you mentioned the documentary. When can people expect to watch that and get to see this story for themselves? Yeah,
it's going to be called The Legend Lives On. We're hoping that it'll be released late 2026, but there's going to be a 4-minute trailer that's coming out November 10 on the actual anniversary of the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And you can watch the ceremony for the 50th anniversary at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum. That'll be streamed worldwide. And we expect an audience of 400 to 500,000 people watching that. And there will be a link to watch that 4-minute trailer. So our trailer should get a lot of exposure coming out of the gate.
Awesome. Well, Jim, thank you so much for coming today. I so appreciate you coming and for sharing the story of this swim.
Madeline, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
And before we go, Matt, we've spent weeks and weeks really digging into this story. What's one finding that really stood out to you?
I mean, there's a lot of them. There's even just talking with Ellen today, talking about the weather conditions and how, it kind of does support the rogue wave theory. I thought was really interesting. I thought the conversations that we've had with Rick Mixter, both here for the special and other times I've talked with him, just finding out there's so much information that is out there, even though we don't have an exact reason for what the ship went down. Even just reading his book, Tattletale Sounds, which I would, if you are fascinated by shipwrecks or fascinated by the Edmund Fitzgerald, is definitely, there's all sorts of really interesting stuff in there, between finding out, exactly where the wreckage lies, to talking about, he actually spoke to Jean-Michel Cousteau, who was part of the in 1980 dive to the wreck. And obviously Cousteau is such a big deal in the diving world, but he kind of explained that they learned a lot about being on the Great Lakes. But as far as the shipwreck goes, the Edmund Fitzgerald is just really another run-of-the-mill shipwreck. And it's one of those things where we've kind of talked about how this is such a big deal locally for our community here in West Michigan. But for a lot of other parts of the world, it's just a story that isn't told. So it was really interesting to see it from that perspective.
Well, and going off of that, for me, I grew up in Michigan. I'd heard about the Edmund Fitzgerald before. Of course, I'd heard the song. But for me, it really was just a legend that had happened before I was born.
Right.
And so I really enjoyed getting to know the story at a deeper level and really appreciating the tragedy for the loss of life that it was, and being able to understand a bit more about who these 29 men were. I mean, they were fathers, they were sons, they were husbands. And like you said, there are so many other shipwrecks out there, especially on the Great Lakes. And it's really important to remember just how powerful the Great Lakes are, and that they can be deadly.
Exactly. Yeah, agree 100%. We're actually going to leave it right there. That'll do it for the Fitz 50 years later. We will leave you with the annual bell ceremony to honor the 29 sailors lost on the Fitz.
Eugene W. O'Brien, wheelsman. John J. Poviak, wheelsman. Thomas D. Bergeson, maintenance.